In classrooms pretty much everywhere, there's this pattern that's really hard to ignore, and it challenges our whole idea of equal opportunity. Why is it that a student's ethnic background can so often be a predictor of how well they do in school? Today, we're going to dig into the really complex reasons behind this educational gap. So, the big question is, why? Why do these gaps even exist? And spoiler alert, there's no single easy answer. Sociologists have been looking at this from every possible angle, and now we're going to start peeling back the layers to see what they found. Okay, first things first, let's just look at the actual data. This chart showing GCSE results, well, it reveals a pretty stark reality. You can see that, on average, British Asian students are getting the highest scores, while Black Caribbean students seem to be facing the biggest challenges. So this isn't just a theory, it's a real statistical pattern that we need to explain. All right, so where do we even begin to look for answers? Well, the first place to start, our first layer, is right inside the school system itself. What exactly is happening within the school gates that could be creating this pattern? Now, one of the first things to get our heads around is that there are really two faces of racism at play here. Overt racism is the stuff that's easy to spot. Name-calling, harassment, that kind of thing. But then there's this other, more subtle kind, cultural racism. It's basically the idea that one culture's way of doing things is the normal or right way. And you can see it in things like a curriculum that only ever talks about white European history, or just biased expectations from teachers. And check out this number, because it really drives this point home. Only about 5% of teachers in the UK come from ethnic minorities. But if you look at the student population, it's around 15% minority. That lack of representation is a big deal. It means a lot of students go through their entire education without seeing themselves reflected in the people teaching them. This is where sociologist David Gilborn comes in. He argues that this isn't just about what individual teachers think or do. He says racism can be baked right into the very structure of a school, almost like a factory that's been designed to produce unequal results. Things like streaming students into different ability sets can work like a conveyor belt, accidentally sorting Black students into lower sets while white students are more likely to end up in gifted and talented programs. And all of this can lead to something really powerful in psychology, the self-fulfilling prophecy. Think about it like this. A teacher, maybe unconsciously, holds a stereotype that a certain group of students is less academic. They communicate those low expectations, maybe without even realizing it. The student picks up on it, starts to believe it themselves, maybe stops trying so hard, and then they underachieve. That failure then just confirms the teacher's original bias, and you get this really damaging, vicious cycle. Okay, but what happens inside the school? That's only one piece of the puzzle, right? For our second layer, we've got to step outside the school gates and look at the huge influence of a student's culture, their family, and their community. And this is where things get, well, really interesting and pretty divided. On one hand, you've got theories trying to explain the underachievement of certain groups, like some Black Caribbean boys, by pointing to things like a higher rate of single-parent homes or the growth of an anti-school culture among their peers. Then, on the complete flip side, the high achievement of many Asian students is often linked to things like very strong family values and a massive emphasis on education. Sociologist Tony Sewell is pretty direct about this cultural argument. He suggests that things like poor parenting and peer groups that think school isn't cool are major factors. Now, it's definitely a controversial view, but it's one that really puts the focus on these external cultural influences. And what about language? Turns out that can be a huge barrier too. Some sociologists argue that schools tend to value one very specific way of speaking, a kind of formal academic language. So if a student comes from a home where a different dialect is spoken, like Black English vernacular, the school might wrongly see that as being less intelligent or incorrect, leading to negative labels, even when that dialect has its own complex grammar and rules. So we've looked at what's happening in the school, and we've looked at what's going on at home. But here's the thing. Students aren't just passive puppets in all of this. For our third layer, let's explore how they actively respond to all these pressures by forming their own identities and subcultures. And when you look at Tony Sewell's research again, you see that the idea of a single response from Black boys, it just falls apart. He found that, yeah, there's a small minority who actively resist the system, but lots of others are what he calls active acceptors. They're totally pro-school. And others are passive resistors, kind of walking this tightrope between fitting in with their friends and still playing by the school's rules. It's just not one single story. And this kind of complexity, it's not just about one group. Research from the sociologist Cheyenne on Asian girls also completely shatters the stereotypes. She found groups she called the survivors, who were really pro-education, but also anti-school groups, and even the rebels, who use school to actually push back against their own cultural traditions at home. The big takeaway here is so important. You just can't paint any ethnic group with a single broad brush. All right, so we've peeled back these three big layers: the school, the culture, and the student's own identity. But the thing is, none of these things exist on their own, in a vacuum. The real heart of the issue, the core, is how they all weave together. So the big question is, how do all these factors stack up against each other? Well, sociologists Gilborn and Mirza give us a really powerful way to think about it. They argue that the single biggest factor in educational inequality isn't actually ethnicity, it's social class. Then comes ethnicity as the next most significant factor. And after that comes gender, which has the smallest impact of the three. It's a hierarchy that really helps put the whole puzzle into perspective. And this, right here, is probably the most important takeaway of all. We shouldn't fall into the trap of arguing about whether class matters more than ethnicity, or ethnicity matters more than gender. The real story, the most significant part, is how they intersect, how they combine and build on each other. Think about it. The journey of a working-class Black Caribbean boy is shaped by a totally different set of forces than that of a middle-class British Asian girl. And all of this leaves us with one last and pretty-huge question. We've seen this isn't about one single cause, but this incredibly complex web of things inside and outside of school, all tangled together. So if the problem is this layered, this interconnected, where on earth do you even begin to try and make a real change?